The inaugural address that Lincoln gave for his second inauguration has become a kind of classic. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. I primarily write about the 19th century United States. I've written a lot about the Civil War era, and traditionally I've written mostly about the Civil War and Reconstruction. So the 1864 presidential election was held in the middle of the Civil War, and there were questions about whether the United States could even go through with a presidential election during this emergency. In the 1864 election, somewhere around 150,000 soldiers cast their votes by mail. And this was really the first time in American history that there was such widespread voting by mail in this effort to make sure that soldiers could cast their votes. So Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863. And after that, African-American men had started enlisting in the U.S. Army as soldiers. The month or so before Lincoln's second inauguration were really dramatic times in Washington, D.C. On January 31st of that year, 1865, Congress finally passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. A man named John S. Rock, a lawyer from Massachusetts, becomes the first African-American man to be admitted to the Supreme Court bar. In other words, the first Black lawyer who can argue cases before the Supreme Court. In mid-February, an African-American minister named Henry Highland Garnett preached a sermon from the dais in the House of Representatives. And he became the first Black man ever to speak in the United States House of Representatives. The topic of his talk was the significance of passage of the 13th Amendment. Around that same time, a Black man named Martin Delany became the first commissioned line officer in the United States Army. They were all already civil rights activists, and now they themselves were making inroads into these positions of power and influence in Washington. And so you see on the ground all of this dynamism of people thinking ahead to what the United States would look like after the war, even in a moment when the war wasn't completely over. The inaugural address that Lincoln gave for his second inauguration has become a kind of classic, but he tries to find meaning in the war. And a lot of people remember Lincoln's second inaugural address for the words he spoke about bringing the nation back together. He said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds. And he calls for the nation to come back together. But what we have to remember is that in that same speech, he developed the argument that the Civil War might well be God's punishment on America for continuing the institution of slavery. And he declares that he, as president, and the United States are going to see that war through to the end, to the final destruction of slavery, because it appears that that is God's will. So it is both a conciliatory speech with the hope that the nation will come back together, but also a very firm speech filled with righteousness about the purpose of the war being to end slavery permanently. My name is Dr. Kate Masur. I'm a historian, and we've just learned about Lincoln's second inauguration.